The smell of burning silk is distinctive. It does not just smell like smoke, it smells like money, like wasted labor. And in the royal court of 15th century precarious Europe, it smelled like shame. When the Dowager Duchess commanded the torch be brought forward, the entire great hall fell into a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. 300 nobles watched, holding their breath, as the flames caught the hem of the silver-threaded gown. The girl wearing it did not scream. She did not cry. She simply stood there, shivering in her undershift, as the symbol of her dignity turned to gray ash on the cold stone floor. Her stepmother smiled, a tight, victorious curl of the lips that signaled total dominance. She believed she had broken the girl's spirit forever. She was wrong, because history tells us that power is a pendulum, and it rarely swings back gently. The same woman who held that torch with such arrogant pride would, only 4 years later, fall to her knees in the mud. She would take that girl's hand, the hand of the daughter she tried to erase, and she would kiss it, her lips trembling with a terror so profound it chilled the blood of everyone who saw it. This is not a fairy tale. There are no knights coming to save the day. This is a story of cold political chess, psychological warfare, and the terrifying price of revenge. Before we step into the shadows of this forgotten court, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We explore the darkest corners of history, where the truth is stranger and often crueler than fiction. The Great Hall of the Duchy of Valois did not clear quickly after the incident. People lingered, their eyes darting between the smoldering pile of silver-threaded silk and the small, shivering figure of Lady Elara standing in her linen undershift. The shame was designed to be absolute. In the rigid hierarchy of the 15th century court, clothes were not merely fabric, they were armor. By stripping Elara of her gown, a garment that had belonged to her late mother and signified her status as the Duke's eldest daughter, Lady Catherine was stripping her of her identity. The stepmother stood on the dais, the torch still smoking in her hand, looking down with a gaze that was devoid of anger. It was something worse. It was cold, bureaucratic indifference. She turned to the gathered nobles, her voice ringing off the stone walls, and declared that such ostentatious displays of wealth were sinful in times of austerity. It was a lie, of course. Everyone knew the duchy was wealthy, but they also knew that the Duke, Elara's father, was bedridden, his mind clouded by a mysterious, lingering fever. Catherine was the regent in all but name, and to challenge her was to court ruin. Elara was not dragged to a dungeon. That would have made her a martyr. Instead, she was subjected to a punishment far more psychologically damaging: invisibility. She was allowed to return to her chambers, but the route she had to walk took her past the whispering courtiers, the snickering page boys, and the averted gazes of knights who had once sworn loyalty to her father. She walked with her head high, her bare feet numb on the flagstones, but inside, something fractured. The naive hope that her father would suddenly burst through the doors, sword in hand to defend her honor, finally died. The Duke was not coming. God was not watching. She was entirely alone in a castle that housed 300 souls. For the next 6 months, the castle transformed into a prison of silence. Lady Catherine dismissed Elara's governess and replaced her with women loyal only to the new regime, spies in aprons who reported every sigh and whisper back to the stepmother. Elara was moved from the royal wing to the drafty northern tower, a place usually reserved for visiting clergy or distant, unimportant relatives. The message was clear: you are becoming irrelevant. Elara's food became simple broth and stale bread, the diet of a penitent. Catherine was systematically erasing her, not by execution, which would cause a scandal among the other noble houses, but by slow social starvation. She wanted Elara to fade away, to become a ghost before she was even dead. But isolation does strange things to the human mind. For the weak, it brings madness. For the intelligent, it brings clarity. Deprived of conversation and comfort, Elara became a master of observation. From her high window, she watched the courtyard below. She tracked who arrived at midnight and who left before dawn. She noticed that the royal physician, a man who had treated her childhood scrapes with kindness, now wore velvet robes far too expensive for his station. She noticed that heavy carts laden with grain were leaving the castle at night, heading not toward the city markets, but toward the southern border, the border shared with the rival kingdom of Ethelgard. The pieces began to form a picture, but it was a picture so treasonous, Elara terrified herself just thinking of it. Catherine wasn't just cruel, she was liquidating the duchy's assets. She was stripping the wealth of Valois to pay off someone. But who? And why? The fear of the burning dress had been replaced by a colder, sharper fear, the realization that her heritage was being sold off piece by piece. One evening, deep in November, the castle was thrown into a chaotic hush. The bells of the chapel began to toll a slow, rhythmic beat. The Duke was dying. Elara demanded to see him, pushing past her guards with a ferocity that startled them. But by the time she reached the royal chambers, the heavy oak doors were barred. Lady Catherine stood outside, flanked by 4 men-at-arms. She looked at Elara, not with the triumph she had shown in the great hall, but with a dismissal that stung worse. "He does not wish to see you," Catherine lied, her voice smooth as oil. "He wants to remember you as you were, not as the sullen, rebellious child you have become." Elara was forced back to her tower, listening to the death knell of the only person who could legally protect her. That night, the castle was a tomb, but grief gave way to a sudden, frantic necessity. Elara knew that once her father was buried, Catherine's regency would become absolute. Elara would be married off to a brute or sent to a convent within the week. She had to act. Using a servant's passage she had discovered months prior, a narrow, spider-filled chute behind the tapestry in her room, Elara slipped out of the tower. She didn't go to the chapel to pray. She went to the physician's quarters. She needed to know why her father, a man of ox-like strength, had withered away in less than a year. The room was empty, the physician likely attending to the body. Elara rifled through his desk, her hands shaking, finding nothing but standard ledgers. She was about to leave, defeated, when her foot knocked loose a floorboard beneath the window. It wasn't a loose board, it was a hiding place. Inside lay a small leather-bound journal and a bundle of letters sealed with red wax. Elara broke the seal on the top letter, holding it up to the moonlight filtering through the glass. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to the general of the Ethelgard armies, their sworn enemy. She read the first line, and her breath hitched in her throat. It wasn't just a letter, it was a receipt. The poison mimics the consumption perfectly, as promised. The dosage must be increased on the night of the solstice. Once the Duke is gone, the southern gates must be left unmanned. Elara froze. The floorboards creaked behind her. She spun around, clutching the letter to her chest. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the flickering candle he held, was not the physician. It was the captain of the guard, a man everyone believed to be Lady Catherine's most loyal dog. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, and his face was unreadable in the shadows. He saw the letter in her hand. He saw the terror in her eyes. He took a step forward, drawing the blade with a slow, metallic hiss that echoed in the silence. "You should not have found that little bird," he whispered. The silence in the physician's quarters was so profound that the sputtering candle sounded like a bonfire. Elara stared at the captain of the guard, a man named Silas, whose face was a map of old scars and rigid duty. He looked at the treasonous letter in her trembling hand, then at her terrified eyes. He had served her father for 20 years. He had taught Elara how to hold a hawk when she was 6. Now, he stood between her and survival, his sword drawn, the steel gleaming with a dull, predatory light. "Give it to me," Silas said. His voice was not a bark, but a low, rough whisper. Elara hesitated. To give him the letter was to give up her only weapon, but she was 17, unarmed and cornered. With a hand that felt like it belonged to a corpse, she extended the parchment. Silas took it. He read the damning lines, the proof that Lady Catherine had poisoned the Duke and sold the southern borders to the enemy general. Elara watched his face for a flicker of rage, of loyalty, anything, but Silas remained stone. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the letter into the flame of the candle. Elara gasped, lunging forward, but his heavy gloved hand caught her shoulder, pinning her in place. She watched in horror as the proof of her father's murder curled into black ash, drifting onto the floorboards. "Paper is weak, my lady," Silas said, crushing the ashes with his boot. "Accusations against a regent require armies, not ink. If you walk into that hall with a piece of paper, you will not survive the night. Catherine will have you hanged for forgery before you finish the first sentence." He sheathed his sword with a sharp click. "I am arresting you for disturbing the peace. You will be confined to the lower keep, and you will say nothing. Do you understand? Silence is the only shield you have left." It was a betrayal, yet it was a rescue. By arresting her for a minor offense, he was removing her from the board, hiding her in the one place Catherine wouldn't think to look for a threat: the damp, rat-infested misery of the lower cells. As Elara was marched through the corridors, her wrists bound, she realized the cruel lesson Silas had just taught her. Innocence was irrelevant. Truth was useless without power. The girl who had cried over a burnt dress was gone. In the darkness of the cell, a cold, calculating woman began to take her place. 3 days passed in the dark. Above, the castle was in a frenzy. The Duke was buried with hasty, hollow pomp. Lady Catherine, draped in black velvet that cost more than a peasant's lifetime earnings, stood by the grave and wept tears that everyone knew were fake, yet no one dared to question. Immediately following the funeral, she declared a state of emergency. She announced that bandits were threatening the southern border, and that she, as regent, would assume total control of the treasury to hire mercenaries for protection. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. She was using the very invasion she had orchestrated as the excuse to seize absolute power. But the best-laid plans of traitors often rot from the inside. The twist came a week later, on the night of the winter solstice. The great hall was filled with the nervous energy of a court living under a tyrant. Catherine sat on the Duke's high seat, sipping wine, waiting for the messenger who would confirm that the Ethelgard army had secured the border, which was code for them taking their payment and propping up her regime. The doors banged open. A messenger did arrive, but he was not carrying a scroll. He was covered in mud and blood, stumbling as he ran toward the dais. "My lady!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "They haven't stopped! The Ethelgard forces! They didn't stop at the border forts!" Catherine stood up, her glass slipping from her fingers and shattering. "What are you saying? We have an agreement." "There is no agreement," the messenger cried, falling to his knees. "General Kalen has burned the southern villages. He is not here to help you hold the duchy. He is here to take it. His vanguard is an hour away. He says he does not make treaties with poisoners." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The treason was out. In one terrifying moment, Catherine's house of cards collapsed. She had invited the wolf into the sheepfold, thinking she held the leash, only to realize the wolf was hungry. The nobles turned to her, their fear replaced by a sudden, dangerous realization of her incompetence. The murmuring grew louder, an angry tide rising against the dais. Catherine looked around wildly. She needed the army. She needed the city guard. She looked to Captain Silas, who stood by the heavy oak doors. "Captain!" she shrieked, her composure shattering into shrill desperation. "Rally the men! Defend the walls! I command you!" Silas didn't move. He didn't bow. He simply rested his hand on the pommel of his sword and looked at her with the same dead-eyed stare he had given Elara. "The men are confused, my lady," Silas said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the panicked crowd. "They hear the enemy approaches. They hear the duchy is sold. They will not fight for a regent who has no blood claim to this land. Soldiers do not die for contracts. They die for kings. They die for the true blood." The room went deadly silent. The sound of distant war horns began to drift through the stone walls, a low, mournful drone signaling the approach of the enemy army. The outer gates were already groaning under the impact of the first battering ram. Catherine was alone on the dais. She had the crown, the gold, and the title, but she had lost the room. She realized with a jolt of nausea that the 300 people staring at her were no longer subjects. They were witnesses to her execution. She needed a shield. She needed something, someone that the soldiers would fight for. Silas turned his head slowly, looking not at Catherine, but at the heavy iron door that led to the dungeons. "If you want the men to hold the walls," Silas said, his voice dark and heavy with fate, "you have to give them something worth saving. Bring up the girl." The sound of the battering ram hitting the main gate felt like the heartbeat of a dying giant. Boom, boom, boom. Dust drifted down from the high vaulted ceiling of the great hall, coating the fine tapestries in a layer of gray grit. Lady Catherine stood by the throne, her face a mask of pale terror. The nobility, who had fawned over her just hours before, had backed away, leaving a wide, isolating circle around her. They knew how these nights ended. When the gates broke, the mob would want blood, and they would offer up the regent to save themselves. Captain Silas returned from the dungeons, but he did not come alone. Elara was unrecognizable. The girl who had been stripped of her silver gown 4 years ago was now stripped of everything else. Her feet were bare and bleeding. her fingernails black with dungeon filth, and she wore a rough burlap sack that smelled of mold. She blinked in the harsh torchlight, her eyes adjusting to the room she had been banished from. But as she straightened her spine, a hush fell over the panicked crowd. Despite the rags, despite the grime, she looked exactly like her father. She had the same jawline, the same unyielding stare. She did not look at the nobles. She looked only at Catherine. "The gate will hold for another hour, perhaps less," Silas announced, his voice flat. "The soldiers on the wall are wavering. They know the general is coming. They are preparing to throw down their weapons and surrender." He turned his gaze to Catherine. "They will fight for the duchy, but they will not fight for a poisoner. If you want to live, madam, you must give them a reason to die protecting this hall. You must give them the true duchess." Catherine's hands shook uncontrollably. The arrogance that had allowed her to burn a young girl's dress, to starve her, to erase her existence, evaporated in the face of imminent death. She looked at the angry faces of the courtiers, then at the sword at Silas's hip, and finally at Ilara. She realized the terrible irony of her position. The only thing standing between her and the executioner's blade of the Ethelgard army was the stepdaughter she had tried to destroy. What must I do?" Catherine whispered, her voice cracking. "Kneel," Ilara said. The word was not shouted. It was spoken with a quiet, terrifying authority. The hall went silent. Even the battering ram seemed to pause. Catherine hesitated, her pride fighting a losing battle against her survival instinct. Then, slowly, painfully, she sank to the stone floor. The rustle of her expensive black velvet sounded obscenely loud. She bowed her head, exposing the nape of her neck, a posture of total submission. "Your hand, my lady," Silas prompted, though his eyes were hard. Ilara extended her right hand. It was not the soft, perfumed hand of a princess anymore. It was thin, the skin rough, the wrist bony from malnutrition. It was a hand that had clawed at stone walls in the dark. Catherine reached out and took it. Her fingers were ice cold. She brought Ilara's dirty, scarred knuckles to her lips. The entire court watched as the woman who had once held the torch now trembled violently, her tears dripping onto the very hand she had sworn to crush. She kissed it, a kiss of desperate, pathetic fealty. "I acknowledge," Catherine sobbed, the words tearing out of her throat. "I acknowledge the true blood. I acknowledge the Duchess of Valois." Ilara did not pull her hand away. She let the moment hang in the air, searing the image into the minds of every witness. Then she pulled her hand back, wiping the spot Catherine had kissed on her burlap dress, as if the contact had soiled her. She turned to Silas. "Open the balcony doors." Ilara stepped out onto the high balcony overlooking the besieged courtyard. The wind whipped her rags around her like a war banner. Below, the soldiers looked up, expecting to see the hated regent. Instead, they saw the ghost of their dead duke in the face of his daughter. Ilara didn't need a speech prepared by scribes. She screamed one word, a cry of rage and reclamation that echoed off the battlements. "Valois!" It was enough. The sight of the true heir, alive and defiant, broke the spell of defeat. The soldiers roared back. The shame of serving a traitor vanished, replaced by the fervor of protecting their own. The defense that night was not strategic. It was feral. They held the breach. They fought with a fury that stunned the Ethelgard forces, pushing them back from the walls until dawn broke, and the enemy, realizing the cost of the siege was too high, retreated into the mist. When the sun rose, the castle was safe, but the reckoning was just beginning. Elara sat on her father's throne, still wearing her rags. She had refused to change. She wanted them to see. Captain Silas stood before her, awaiting orders. 2 guards held Lady Catherine, who was no longer trembling, but stood in a state of catatonic shock. "Shall we prepare the executioner's block?" Silas asked. "No," Elara said, her voice cool and detached. "Death is too quick, and it makes people martyrs." She looked at her stepmother. "She likes the fire, does she not? She likes to watch things burn." Elara gestured to the north. "Take her to the convent at the edge of the frozen waste. She will not be a nun. She will be the laundress. She will scrub the linens of the lepers until her hands are raw, and she will do it in silence. If she speaks a word of who she was, cut out her tongue." Elara stood up, walking down the steps of the dais. She stopped in front of Catherine, leaning in close. "You burned my dress because you thought it made me weak. You forgot that fire tempers steel." As Catherine was dragged away, screaming silently into the void of her future, Elara turned to the window. She had won. She was the Duchess. But as she looked at her reflection in the glass, she saw the cold, hard eyes of a woman who had learned that mercy was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had survived the monster by becoming a different kind of beast. History often shows us that the wheel of fortune is relentless. Those who abuse power when they are high often find themselves crushed by it when the wheel turns. But the tragedy of revenge is that it changes the victim too. Elara reclaimed her throne, but she lost her innocence in the process. We must be careful how we fight our monsters, lest we become them. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We upload gripping tales from the shadows of history every week, and you won't want to miss the next one. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Elara's punishment for her stepmother was just, or was it too cruel? I'll be reading your replies. Until next time.